Bill, first of all, thanks for making time because I know how busy you are.
No, I appreciate you having me. Cheers, Tony.
Um, I've been looking forward to this, and I know everybody in New Zealand know who you are, but for my overseas guests, I want to tell them just you probably spent more time with all the top athletes in New Zealand than anyone else in your capacity as Sport New Zealand. But before we go there, I'm real interested to know, where did little Billy Smart, what did he do when he was a kid, and when did you start thinking about how can I improve and all that sort of thing?
It's a bit of a different backstory than you would probably expect, to be honest. I, was not the most sporty person in school, which is funny enough because now I've worked in sports the last 12 plus years. But I, was quite overweight and basically got into the gym to try to lose some weight, and maybe lost about 30 kilos at the time. During that time, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do, so I went and did a bridging course. Did some science in that. Wasn't the most academic person in high school, and found that I was just very, very interested in how things work, and that was kind of interesting for me. So that led to, I've spent this time in terms of training. I really enjoy training now, and I really enjoy learning how things work. So I went and did a sports science degree. And that was probably, I went into that, funny enough, I remember sitting in a class in year one, and everyone is sports people and doing sports, and even at that time, I was someone who was just doing a lot of gym stuff, not super involved in sports. And, I felt a little bit out of place. And it wasn't until later that year, a good friend of mine actually introduced me to sport of kickboxing. So he was training in Hamilton, a place called Stormforce, with Northern Storm. So I went down there and, hit the bag a few times and just absolutely loved it. And that was around the time when I started, watching the UFC and getting into the UFC. And honestly, I've basically just been obsessed with combat sport and MMA in particular ever since.
Okay, and that's how you've ended up here. But in between time, you have contact with all the top sports people from all different sports. Can you tell us about some of the some?
Yeah, I've worked for High Performance Sport for the last since 2017. I worked in high performance sporting programs for the 2 years prior to that. For about the last 10 years, primarily worked within the rowing and cycling sports. Basically all around, from the endurance athletes to the sprint athletes, from the pathways to the elite athletes, as well as just being very fortunate to have a good network of coaches in Cambridge and throughout the country as well. Basically in the High Performance Training Centre in Cambridge, if you're an athlete and you are top 8 in the world, you're training in the gym, and basically all the training environments are those types of athletes together, and everyone's trying to get better, which is great. So very fortunate to have spent a lot of time around those types of athletes, but also the coaches. Just some phenomenal coaches in Cambridge, especially, that I've been able to rub shoulders with.
You're dealing with top, the best, the Olympic athletes and all that. And how do you get that extra out of them when they're already that good?
Honestly, there's probably two ways to break it down, and one is the development side of things when it comes to athletes. How do we get to this point where we're sort of performing at a peak and a high level, and then once you are there, well, how do we find the next level? And that's kind of where you have to be a bit more methodical and calculated with how you approach things. And in sports like that, a lot of the times it comes down to the big rocks in terms of how do we take our strength and conditioning, or performance-based programming, and how do we integrate it very, very well with the sport. So that's probably one of the largest things. And then two, if we can break down exactly what drives the athlete to perform the way they do, we can understand that a little bit better, and we can start to separate those components and then evaluate them. We can start to look at where those little gaps are where we can perform or find greater performance changes.
Is there a common theme between all athletes that are way up there, or are they all different? Like they all have different mindsets. They all have.
Good question. One thing that I have noticed, and actually I can tell you this. This will go personally soon. But I can't say which sport. But one of the main sports in New Zealand, which was one of our highest medal winning sports, good medal haul at the last Olympics at Paris. Basically, what separated the athletes who podiumed, who won medals, and who didn't, they had higher training availability. So consistency is always very, very important within that sort of system. Apart from that, like you definitely find like the best athletes. One, like there's always that consistency over time. Two, mentally they operate a little bit differently. Like they have the ability to push a little bit more. They're a bit more competitive with others, and they have the ability to sustain that over periods of time. And I think that's where like high-level coaching and being in the right training environments, if you can enable those types of athletes, then those are the ones who do exceptionally well.
Is there a limit? Can you go too far? Do you find out that, like I know peaking at the right time is a thing, and how do you know when, because I've heard that everything's going well and then they just crash, and it happened just before they were finishing their training.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is having the right ability to keep track of athletes and where they are, and whether or not it's things like recovery or performance. And I think within sports setting, it's common in those types of environments, those high performance environments, where we're basically keeping track of everything. So we understand, we have historical trends we can look at. We understand that when an athlete has performed well at a certain time, we're able to zoom out on that and look at what led up to that point. So we can create the ability to map how that is. And yeah, that's probably one of the bigger ones. It's something that we can do with things like HRVs, with taking general performance tracking. Having like historical things to reflect on is very helpful for that. But every athlete's different, and that's why it's so important.
The thing that I noticed, I come in here one day just by chance, and you were holding a seminar here, and all of a sudden there was all things up on the board about pre-training and different levels of training.
Yeah, I think training, you can kind of break it down into two different parts. You can break training down into like development and performance. And, when I train to perform, that's going to be when I'm, say, a professional, and outcome is very important. When I train to develop, I'm looking at performance stretch out over a longer period of time. So that's sort of more of your, amateur athletes or athletes who are maybe, just getting up to pros or even starting pros. And it's really important that, if I'm a developing athlete and I adopt like a performance mindset, a temporary performance mindset, potentially I end up, maybe it means I do the same training camp over and over again. I don't manipulate my training structure and the exercises that I do to support long-term growth. Potentially then I end up having like a stalling effect. So that's sort of one of the bigger things that we don't want to happen. So one of the ways we combat that is to have a better training structure, which is basically known as periodization. And that's pretty much what we did here. It was taking sort of what existed already and then filling some of the gaps of that. And I thought that was pretty good. It's a starting point, and I'm excited to push things a little bit deeper because there's many layers as you go through some of the stuff.
There's something stick in your mind, and I can remember when I was like maybe 30, 40 years ago, I read something that said a man's peak strength is 34 years of age. That could have changed. Or what's your thoughts on that as far as maturity and getting stronger or losing speed?
Yeah, so we do lose physical qualities as we age. I think the thing that is really important to consider, though, is what have I done up until that point? Because the reality is most people, even some of the highest level athletes, they haven't trained to their potential, if that makes sense. Yeah. So if you were to say maybe you lose 5 or 10% top end, but you've got 20% in the tank in terms of development, then you can offset that. So generally you'll find that, you know, speed is something that is harder to maintain, as well as like the elastic qualities through the system, like the ability to bounce the flow is something that starts to degrade with time. But the benefit is we can train to make it better. Sometimes we just need to reach a bit deeper into the toolbox, like to do some of those things. That was probably one of the bigger things we did with Izzy before his last fight, which was quite successful. Yeah.
What's the difference between a fighter, you know, where you're going in and you can be injured, as opposed to somebody that's just doing something like rowing or cycling or whatever, where you're not? Is there a fear factor in there that we don't know about, or what?
100%. So I think one thing that we do when it comes to performance is we often separate the brain or the mind and the body. And like the reality is, from a physiological standpoint, those two are not separated. They're one and the same. So my brain is going to guide basically how my body is able to activate muscles, how it is able to regulate like energy systems, energy usage. If I don't have the ability to be in control of this, then I don't have the ability to be in control of my output. So like the people who can regulate that better and can perform on the night, who show up and can, you know, perform under the lights, like that's a massive part of it. Dan's a great example of it. Like as someone who is he could just perform. It's awesome. And I'll give you a really controversial take. It's not controversial, but I'm just going to use this as an example. It's a bad one. You know, there was a whole bunch of stuff that came out over the weekend around is it Carlos Prates, the guy who smokes and drinks and goes and knocks out a former champ. And it's like, you know, there's connections to that. It's not about the smoking, not at all. But someone who's relaxed enough to not be bothered about certain things, that's probably a mental trait that's going to carry over to other places. Don't go smoke and drink before your next competition, but it does highlight that that's something that we can work on, and that we probably should work on.
Again, on the mental thing, have you seen fighters or sportsmen that they've got to obviously that level, but then when it comes to the Olympics or UFC or something like that, that nerves overtake them, they just cannot perform?
Yeah, 100%. It's hard, because that is the case. Like, there are a lot of people who are exceptional athletes, like exceptional, in training are exceptional, and then on the night struggle to put it together. And, you know, like, of course you want to look at all the factors, like, are we tapering properly, are we getting the timing right? You know, are we timing our sleep correctly, especially if we're traveling? There's a lot of things like that, and a lot of those things a lot of people could tighten up on, but that is a factor that does prevent people, especially from being great, if they're good, from being great. It's it's something that there's a lot to it.
We talked a little bit off camera the other day, and you said something really interesting, and that was that the fighters on the way up are trying to train too much like the champions.
Yeah, 100%. I think as a developing fighter, so we go back to that development versus performance. Like when I'm in the development bucket, basically what I want to do is I'm looking at, you know, what's my ultimate goal? If I'm an amateur MMA fighter and I want to be in the UFC and maybe I want to be a UFC world champion, then I know that like this is the demand, like it's 5-minute rounds, it's in this context. Basically we want to take that and we want to like develop, like we want to basically reverse engineer what are all the like components that contribute to this, and then how do we break those components apart and then train them over like a 3 to 5 year period maybe. So it's really important to note that when you see professional fighters training and they're doing, you know, specific exercises or, you know, whatever it is that those specific traits that you're trying to develop, they're very much underpinned and enabled by a lot of general like training traits. And I'll give you a really good example, and this is something that happens in the pros as well, is that you'll have an athlete and, you know, say he'll come into a fight camp quite a strong physical base. You know, he's basically coming in with reserves. So we could think about it from a fitness standpoint, from a strength standpoint, from the ability to tolerate work. And he goes through fight camp and he's able to sort of like cash in those reserves, and then, you know, his payment for that is he becomes fitter in the context of fighting. So that's what we want. Athlete fights, maybe he does well, has a week off, or maybe has a few weeks off, maybe has a few months off, and then gets back into the next fight camp. The reserves are now lower in the next fight camp. We have less to cash in. Athlete doesn't get as much out of the fight camp training, isn't able to build the same level of fitness, isn't able to recover from the same amount of training. And then you do that a few times, potentially what you end up with is significantly impaired physical performance. So it's very important to be considerate of the long term.
What would you say would be an average time for, I know there's some go a lot longer, but top athlete can stay at their prime, win gold medals, win in the UFC. Is there a time limit on that?
It's all in flux. So, for instance, if I was to do a basic performance test, and this is just for one thing, maybe we do a maximal jump every day. Jump will highlight something like your nervous system output qualities. So you'll probably find that over the span of, if I did that every day for a few weeks, this is going to do like this, right? We could probably apply that to trying to peak for a fight as well. Like generally you want to see that this goes up and up and up and up and up, and ideally like everything is at its best on fight day. That's when you know you nailed it. But the reality is, like, as soon as you fight, this is going to drop down here, and this is going to do this all the way through. So I think it's like really important to think about. It's always going to be in flux, and if I try to stay at a peak, I ultimately won't be like the relative peak will be significantly less than it was. And that's when it comes back to like that rebuild, like building up those reserves again. The more reserves you build up, like the more we cash in, and potentially that's your higher peak. And that's what we're after. Like we just get better every time. And to do that, like we need structure around like what we do, how much, and we need to have an ability to track what we do and track the output. Because if I don't track it, then I question where I'm at. Is this the right amount? Like, is it working? And through tracking it, I now have this historical information that every fight camp I can compare to, and I can make decisions very accurately based on that, which that's essentially what high performance training is.
Is there one exercise that is good for all sports?
Yeah, honestly, being strong is important as a base trait, and like if you were to think about basically any sport that requires lower body power, and I think one of the things that people don't quite realize is how much more important lower body power is for a punch than to upper body power or strength. So if you look at a lot of research, not a lot of research articles would correlate upper body strength with higher punch power or impact forces, but all of them will correlate lower body power, lower body strength. So a trap bar deadlift is just a great exercise. If you're looking for something to apply to different areas, trap bar deadlift, awesome.
If you take just the weight for different athletes, is there one sport that makes people stronger than others?
Oh, honestly, Tony, MMA is not the most strength and power dominated sport, which makes sense because it's a grueling task and conditioning is so important. The sports that have very low work times, the output is significantly higher. I could give you an example. The average counter movement jump for a UFC athlete is like 35 centimeters. So we're talking hands on hips, and this is not to a vertex, this is on a force plate, so it's important because vertex is quite different. If I have a BMX athlete that I used to train, his on that same was close to 60 centimeters. So it's night or day. But it's important to note that being good in one area doesn't necessarily mean that it's good for the sport. I make sure that if I look at big picture, what are all the physical qualities that I need? I want to develop those proportionately to what's needed. I don't want to disproportionately develop one area.
I learned today that you've been in the game for a long time, because I didn't know that you were such a lover of combat sport. So this is good for me. So
I appreciate that.
What is the progress that you've seen from when you started going down to Norm at Stormforce to where we are today?
For me personally, or
for
the sport?
for the athletes.
Yeah, it's massively changing. I feel like the culture around higher quality training is improving. I think like even things like before something like strength and conditioning, athletes would question. The question would be, should I do strength and conditioning? Now the question is like, oh, should I do plyometrics or should I do this? It's a really nice progress point. Yeah, it's been massive. I think what's really important, and when you came in for that seminar, one of the big things I touched on was what we forget with MMA is it's very, very young. MMA, the UFC has been around since 1993. You compare that to boxing, like basically any other professional sport, it's basically in its infancy. So when that's the case, what ends up happening is the development is very, very rapid. And whether or not that's just processes, the sport from a technical standpoint, but also the science of training, it's very, very rapid. So it's one of those things that, I mean, for me, like a lot of the drive for what I do is one because I love it, I'm obsessed with it, but I'm also I just hate not being on top of things. Like I hate the idea of people getting better faster. So it's like to me that's anxiety inducing. So that's sort of the drive to make sure that we continually try to update and not just keep up but exceed. And HPSNZ is a really good example. I've used this a couple of times, but we've got this machine, probably can't say its name, it's worth about $500,000. And that was developed off very early research articles that basically didn't specifically confirm a hypothesis, but strongly suggested that would be the case. So if you were to wait for those research articles to come through to like confirm this, then essentially someone else has been doing that for the last few years, and now you're trying to catch up to them. It's like, well, we want to be the ones that people are trying to catch up to.
And how's that going? Like a number of athletes that are in the top, like UFC and that.
Yeah, seriously, it's fantastic. And I think just what is so special here is the training environment's amazing. So in terms of the coaching, the training environment that the coaches deliver together, like it's world class. And essentially when it comes to the physical or the strength and conditioning side of that, it's like how do we best enable like the environment and the technical pieces so that we can basically elevate across the board, because at the highest level it's just those little percentages that make the difference. And we don't want to miss anything.
I know Israel's a freak, but is there any of the young fighters coming through that you could see on your figures get up to match or get somewhere close?
Yeah, I've actually been really impressed with some of the younger ones coming through, which is fantastic. And for testing, we've got a pretty good setup in terms of a lot of the testing that we do is mirrored by the UFC. There's like a blend of UFC normative data that we'll mix with some of like the IP, and then we've got our own data sets as well. Just long story short, it makes sure that what we're actually comparing is accurate, which is very important. But I've been very impressed with some of the younger ones coming through, and from a development standpoint as well, I've going back to what we were talking about before, I've definitely seen some of those changes, which is great. A lot of the times with athletes, there's kind of those base level of competencies that you need to develop, and the equivalent for maybe a fight coach would be, can you throw a punch mechanically? Can you stay balanced in your stance? And those are kind of the things from a performance standpoint that we need to screen through, because if you lack those sort of basic fundamentals, anything that we tried to do in excess of that is not going to be effective. So I've been really impressed that we've been able to basically, go midway up the ladder, take what they have and kind of refine it a little bit more for them, and just make it a bit more applicable for where they're at in their sport. It's cool. I mean, that for me is development is so important. Like, you don't have a sport if you don't have the ability to develop and funnel athletes through to perform on a world stage, and it starts here. So yeah.
Does every program have to be individual, or do you ever come across and say, oh, I can take this program and I can use it on him and her?
I think the more developed you are, the more need for individualization there is. In saying that though, I think what you'll find is a lot of athletes, the way that they fight is going to be based off like the innate hardware that they have through their system. Like maybe they've got a certain type of muscle which is a lot more geared towards, say, power or explosiveness or endurance, or maybe they're someone who's, you know, very light on their feet and able to, you know, bounce around a lot more. Maybe they're a bit more stiff but they're very strong. Everyone has very different profiles, and I mean that for me is the interesting part, because if we don't have the ability to, essentially what we're doing is looking at if we need to be strong, we need to be powerful, we need to be fit, we need to be agile, like what are all the determinants that feed into each of those, how do we like dissect them, pull them out, evaluate them, and then give them an input that matches what they have. And I mean that's extremely important at a high level. It's still important at a development level, but we often have more of those big rocks that we need to tick as well. So we won't be as detailed with some of those individualizations, but very important.
Ideally, how long would you like to have a program on, or you know, figures kept from a fighter, maybe amateur or maybe winning as an amateur or even as a professional on that road? The more figures, the better you can.
Yeah, 100%. I think if you're especially a developing athlete, really good to just get into the habit of tracking, like because that as a habit is going to help like give you contextual awareness of what you do. It's make you think more about what you do. It's going to develop the discipline that you need to do X, Y, and Z, and it's super important for most athletes. The ideal is that we have metrics or values that we've collected for different areas, and we can identify phases for those, whether it's like the first or second phase fight camp or fight camp overall, off camp, and if we can maybe have a couple of those, 2 or 3 fight camps in, we've got some really nice information to use just to track and evaluate, because every week it's like, where is the athlete, where has he been and where should he be? And if you ask those questions and you make those little pivot points, that's essentially how you ensure that you get to the right destination. It's kind of like using a GPS. If you just go GPS off and drive, and then you drive for a couple of hours and turn the GPS on and realize that you went 2 hours in the wrong direction, that's the byproduct of when you don't have those check-ins very frequently. That would be the same as if you just had measures that you looked at after a fight, apart from you've already been in a car accident, and you don't have the ability to use those to make those crucial changes. If there are issues, I want to deal with them straight away.
I guess a lot of fighters will like me asking this question, but you fight, you celebrate real hard and drink and carry on, and how much does that put you back?
I think there's a balance. I think what's important to note is, as a development athlete, you should probably get back in the gym. After a big fight especially, there's obviously the physical expression, but a lot of it is the psychological, mental toll, emotional toll that comes from the fight. So what you'll find if you were tracking something like HRV for readiness, you'll probably find that fight week starts to go down already a little bit because there's stress, but post-fight it takes a dive. So essentially when we start to look at that, and you'd see the same if you were looking at something like nervous system output, which is a little bit different. If I was then to throw an athlete into training, their physical systems aren't available to express in the way that they're required. And if they're not available to express in the way they're required, then they're also not available to recover, which means you just don't get a positive training effect off it. So it's regardless of what you do, you're going to be in the red. My suggestion would be just keep it relatively brief, get moving the next week, then get into the week afterwards.
Is there anything you've noticed between a fighter winning and losing, especially at top level, whether the motivation or the other figures go down with the motivation, or what?
Not so much. I think it's less about the motivation and more about the action. So the fighters who let that take away from their training quality and like training becomes very ad hoc, and that basically would be they get back into training a couple of weeks later or a week later or whatever it is, but there's no structure. They can't just like going through the motions because they feel like they should. Like that would be the negative effect. Having those negative emotions with good structure, that eliminates that problem, and that's why it's so important. People don't realize, especially if you're a developing athlete, even as a pro, like the turnaround for fights is not that long. Like we really need to maximize the time in between fight camps to develop and cash as much as we can, develop those reserves.
Bill, we've got Dan fighting this week, and I think he's a different person, a special person. Is he different in any sort of way than some other fighters that you've dealt with?
He's different. He's the quintessential example of someone who like mentally is built to compete. And like the example I was saying, this is a great experience for me was, to be with Dan for his last fight week and just seeing how he was more calm, more happy than I've ever seen him, like in the gym or anywhere. Like he was on cloud nine. This is fight week. It was on fight day. No different. Like he was even happier, even more chill on fight day. And I was in the car transporting to the venue with him, and nothing changed. He's, like if you were to consider from a physical perspective, what happens when I start to get nervous or anxious? Like heart rate goes up, like cortisol goes up. I start to use different fuels differently. When you can maintain that level of composure, that's not a factor. You see how he's won some of his fights. He's just come back, and I mean, 100%. Just he's different.
While we're talking about Dan, we have to talk about injuries because he's had more than most. But
Yep.
Where would you rate injuries as the biggest bugbear for your job?
Oh, it's massive. It's massive in all high performance sport settings. When you are trying to push like boundaries, it's always a factor, and it's even harder in MMA because like contact, and it's one of those things that you will never be able to prevent injuries, but you can increase your likelihood of suffering an injury. And a lot of that comes down to making sure that you come into fight camp in a good place. You've got a good base of physical training. A big part of adapting to training is your system, like all systems, adapting to workload. And as I do that, the tissue becomes, it develops, it thickens, muscles, the tendons, like ligaments. And a big part of that is going to contribute to keeping you safe during fight camp, because it's a hard sport. People get injured, and I mean, basically, you just want to shuffle the cards and have them in your favor, because it's always a factor. And also have a good physio. As seriously, it's very important. Like for my job, everything I do is you're connected to a physio. Like you're working like from as a performance trainer as an S&C, but the physio is a key part of that, because you're always trying to balance. I need to perform, I need to get the most out of my training, but I need to make sure these injuries are basically just getting better and not getting worse and not preventing me from doing anything. That'd be my advice. Now training before fight camp, build a good base, a good reserve. Like the gym is a good place for that as well. It's one that we've done with a lot of especially the heavier, more powerful guys, like the guys who maybe because they're so powerful, they're more prone to having injuries. You need to develop the tissue more and more to support them as well. So maybe that's another example of some of those specific work-ons. But yeah, train well before fight camp and have a good physio.
There you go. I know you've got a powerful man you've got to
Thank
go
you.
and see.
Yes,
The beer's waiting on you. So, hey, thanks, and we'll catch up again
Yeah,
sometime.
that'd be
if
great.
that's
100%. I really appreciate this.
Thank you so much.
No, thank
Appreciate
you.
that, mate. Brilliant.
I've got some nice lemon spice on the cab for him. Oh, thank you. I've made it for you.